Welcome to this explainer. Today we're practically grabbing our fedoras and cracking the whip to unearth the truth. We're going to break down the actual history, the deep theology, and the very real post-colonial realities behind pop culture's absolute favorite archaeologist. I mean, we all know the hat, the whip, the epic adventures, but what really lies beneath all that cinematic magic? We're going to unpack the actual sources and the hard science to find out.
You know the scene. It's 1981, there's a mist-filled South American jungle, and our hero is carefully eyeing a golden idol right before that massive boulder chases him out. It's iconic, right? It set the absolute standard for action movies, and basically defined the public's perception of archaeology for an entire generation. But it also established a very specific narrative about who gets to take historical artifacts, and, more importantly, why.
But here's the thing, we really have to ask ourselves, does this beloved cinematic archaeology actually belong in a museum of outdated ideas? As viewers, it's so easy to get swept up in the nostalgia and the sheer thrill of the chase. But modern scholars, anthropologists, and real-world archaeologists are increasingly asking us to look a bit closer. When we strip away that Hollywood glamour, are we celebrating history, or are we just watching the romanticization of a bygone colonial era where local heritage is treated as nothing more than a prize to be won?
To answer that, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Hollywood's famous archaeologist, move on to the true sacred ark, look at excavating the ancient tabernacle, discuss the colonial smash and grab, and finally, wrap up with what Indy gets right.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Hollywood's famous archaeologist.
So scholars have pointed out that this franchise, and honestly the entire genre it spawned, heavily relies on a concept called fictional heritage colonialism. In these stories, you almost always have a Western protagonist who swoops into a foreign land, completely bypasses the local people, who are usually just depicted as one-dimensional stereotypes, and appropriates their sacred artifacts. The object is completely stripped of its cultural meaning. It's reduced to a mere monetary prize or some magical weapon that belongs in a Western museum, no questions asked.
There is such a stark contrast between fiction and reality here. On the one hand, the cinematic archaeologist relies on explosive looting, dodging booby traps, and completely separating artifacts from the people who actually live there. But on the other hand, we have the real modern archaeologist. Their work is incredibly meticulous. They use non-invasive tools like ground-penetrating radar, and most importantly, their work is heavily community-oriented. They focus on documenting and understanding the context of an item with the direct permission and collaboration of the source community.
Which brings us to Section 2, the true sacred ark.
Now, if we look at the actual historical data for the artifact from that first iconic film, the Ark of the Covenant, a completely different picture emerges. It wasn't just some movie superweapon that melts bad guys' faces. The real Ark was a profound historical and religious artifact with a very specific timeline. According to biblical texts, it was built by Moses around 1445 BC, right after the Exodus. For centuries, it was housed at the ancient site of Shiloh. And then, it just vanishes from the historical record just before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, becoming literally one of history's greatest mysteries.
So what did it actually mean? Well, from a theological standpoint, the Ark served a deeply sacred function. It held immense spiritual meaning. Inside, it contained a jar of manna and Aaron's staff, which symbolized a God of relationship and provision. It held the tablets of the Ten Commandments, representing a God of rule and moral character. And its pure gold lid, that mercy seat flanked by cherubim, was where the high priest would sprinkle blood on the Day of Atonement, symbolizing a God of redemption. It absolutely wasn't a booby-trapped treasure. It was considered the literal footstool of the divine, a connection between heaven and earth.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, excavating the ancient tabernacle.
Check out this massive number, 100,000. That is the staggering amount of animal bones recently discovered by excavators at the ancient site of Shiloh in Israel. But it's not just the sheer volume that's breathtaking, it's what these bones actually represent. They are predominantly from sheep, goats, and cattle. And crucially, they come almost exclusively from the right side of the animals. This precisely matches the requirements outlined in the biblical book of Leviticus, which specifies that the right side of the animal was strictly reserved for priestly offerings.
And the team making these discoveries, led by Dr. Scott Stripling, they aren't out there dodging rolling boulders. They're painstakingly following a rigorous scientific process. First, they located a monumental stone building that matches the exact 2-to-1 dimensional ratio of the biblical tabernacle. Then, they analyzed those thousands of sacrificial bones. Finally, they meticulously dated the surrounding pottery fragments to the Iron Eye period, which perfectly aligns with the biblical timeline of the Ark at Shiloh. It's a beautiful example of how real archaeology is methodical, evidence-based, and deeply illuminated.
This leads us perfectly into Section 4, the colonial smash and grab. Now, back in the realm of fiction, the underlying logic used in those classic adventure films to justify taking artifacts is known as Authorized Heritage Discourse, or AHD for short. It's basically this ingrained mindset that assumes Western experts, like our cinematic hero, are the only ones qualified to identify, champion, and protect heritage. It completely sidelines the local source community. It's essentially saying, hey, we know how to take care of your history far better than you do.
Impartially reporting on the historical data here, controlling heritage isn't just some made-up movie trope. Real-world nationalist regimes have actually manipulated archaeology for heavy political propaganda. The Nazi SS had an actual unit called the Ahnenerbe, and their whole goal was to subdue research to idealize this imagined German past. Similarly, during the Cold War, the Communist Eastern Bloc directed archaeologists to heavily promote Slavic heritage specifically to enforce cultural unity. Controlling the past is a very real, very potent tool for shaping the present.
Ultimately, when cinematic narratives disarm heritage by separating an object from its cultural context, they end up perpetuating a colonial worldview. The local communities are completely ignored or just reduced to an exotic backdrop filled with superstitions. The sacred artifacts simply become plot devices, just waiting for a Western savior to rescue them and lock them behind glass on a totally different continent.
But it's not all bad news. Let's hit Section 5, What Indy Gets Right. Because despite all the heavy academic critique and the exaggerated action, you can actually mount a highly nuanced defense of these films. Why? Because they do inadvertently highlight some very real truths about archaeology. First off, excavation literally is a process of controlled destruction. Once you dig a site up, you destroy its original context forever, which is why real documentation is so vital. Second, as we just saw, historical sites are deeply politically charged and often contested by competing ideologies. And finally, the films occasionally stumble onto the profound truth that heritage actually belongs with the community.
Think back to the 1984 prequel. Our cinematic archaeologist is tasked with retrieving a stolen sacred stone for an Indian village. When someone asks him at the end why he didn't keep the immensely valuable artifact for a Western institution, he drops this incredible line. What for? They just put it in a museum and it'd be another rock collecting dust. It's a shocking moment of realization for a character who is literally defined by taking things from museums. He actually recognizes the living, breathing value of the sacred object to the people who actively revere it.
And that surprising realization brings us perfectly into the reality of modern archaeology. Today's archaeologists deeply understand that protecting heritage absolutely requires the inclusion of broader communities. It's all about public archaeology now. We see this happening right this very minute, with the repatriation of indigenous ancestors back to Australia, or the return of sacred statues to local villages. It's no longer just about depositing exotic items in Western museums, it's about repairing historical fractures and respecting the true owners of the past. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to chew on. The next time you sit down with a bowl of popcorn to watch one of these thrilling cinematic adventures, try to look past the whip and the fedora. Look at the ancient stones, the sacred artifacts, and the local communities depicted on screen, and ask yourself, if our past is buried, who really has the right to dig it up? Thanks so much for joining us, and keep questioning the world around you.